My best friend disappeared without a trace on an ordinary night. There was no goodbye, no messages, no signs that something was wrong. At first, we all thought it was a joke, one of those temporary disappearances people make to clear their heads, but the days started piling up like dust in an abandoned house. I'm going to be honest from the beginning, because I think that honesty is what gives meaning to everything that comes afterward. During the first 3 days, I wasn't worried. Not even a little. Not at all. Zero. And that's what weighs on me the most now. Not the fact that I lost track of him, not the feeling that I didn't do enough, but those 3 days of complete indifference, of unanswered messages that I read, closed, and moved on from as if nothing had happened, as if Daniel's absence were something so normal and expected that it didn't deserve even a second of extra attention. I'd known Daniel since we were 16 years old. 11 years of friendship, which sounds simple when you say it quickly, but becomes infinitely more complicated when you try to describe it in detail. 11 years of knowing someone so deeply that you stop realizing you're still getting to know them. 11 years of knowing how he breathes when he's nervous, what he always orders at every restaurant without even looking at the menu, how his laugh sounds when something genuinely amuses him versus when he's just being polite, which was far more often than people realized because Daniel had a very practiced kind of social tolerance that very few people ever got to see from the inside. We met in a history class neither of us wanted to take during our final year of high school, when both of us had waited so long to register that the only section left was the one with the most inconvenient schedule imaginable, Fridays at 7 in the morning. On the first day, we both showed up late, which is actually difficult when class starts at 7 because it means waking up after 6:30, but somehow we both managed it, and the only seats left were the two in the back, side by side. He was reading a book that had absolutely nothing to do with the class. He wasn't hiding it, wasn't even pretending to tuck it under the desk. It was open right on top of his notebook, completely visible to the professor, with that kind of quiet confidence that isn't arrogance so much as the certainty that if you aren't bothering anyone, no one really has a reason to bother you. Meanwhile, I was drawing in the margins of my notebook, something I'd done since elementary school and never managed to stop, a kind of mental tick that helped me process what I was hearing, assuming I was hearing anything at all. Neither of us said a word during that first hour. No greeting, no glance of recognition, nothing. But at the end of class, when the professor asked us to pair up for the semester project, we looked at each other at the exact same moment with the exact same expression, something halfway between resignation and relief, and without saying a single word we became project partners. Then friends. Then the kind of friends who no longer need to explain why they're friends because the friendship has existed for so long that it has become its own explanation. 11 years of that. And what makes those 11 years so heavy, what makes all of this hurt in a way I still don't fully know how to describe, is that when something exists in your life for that long, it starts becoming invisible in the same way the sound of a refrigerator at night becomes invisible. Not because it's gone, but because it's so constantly there that you stop registering it. And that was exactly the problem. The last time I saw him was on a Tuesday. Not a special Tuesday, not one circled anywhere on a calendar, not one I could have distinguished from any other Tuesday that year. It was one of those October days in my city where the sky hangs low and the cold is damp, not enough to justify a scarf but enough to irritate you anyway, the kind of day with no personality of its own, existing only as a gray backdrop for more important things that are happening, or could be happening. We were at his apartment, the same one he'd lived in for the last 4 years. Third floor of a red brick building on a street lined with trees that gave good shade in summer and covered the sidewalk in leaves during autumn because nobody ever swept often enough. The elevator had been broken since spring and had become a recurring joke among the tenants, the kind of joke that stopped being funny months ago but still gets repeated because it's the only shared language people have left. We ordered pizza from a place Daniel had discovered 2 months earlier and had insisted on ordering every single time I came over ever since, with the conviction of someone who's found something genuinely good and needs the rest of the world to know about it too. The pizza was good, I'll admit that. We watched a documentary about Roman engineering that he picked with that quiet enthusiasm of his, the kind that comes from knowing exactly what you want and not needing to convince anyone else that your choice is valid. I told him it sounded boring. He told me to shut up and watch it. And I did. 20 minutes later I was more interested than I wanted to admit, because Daniel had this specific ability to infect people with his enthusiasm without them realizing the exact moment they started sharing it. He'd been doing that ever since I met him, and I never fully learned how to resist it. We talked about meaningless things. We talked about a coworker of his who drove him insane, a guy named Roberto whom he described with such exhausted precision that I could visualize him perfectly despite never having seen him. We talked about whether it was worth switching phone plans, a debate we'd been postponing for weeks because we both thought there were too many variables involved and neither of us felt like sitting down to do the serious analysis it required. We talked about a song I'd heard on the bus on the way to his place that I couldn't identify but couldn't get out of my head either, in that specific obsessive way melodies cling to you when you can't name them. We spent half an hour trying to find that song. Daniel took the search much more seriously than the situation required, the way he always did with small problems, applying the same total concentration to trivial things that he did to important ones. We eventually found it. It was by an artist neither of us knew, and we both thought it was reasonably good but not good enough to save. We moved on from it immediately and started talking about something else. Nothing unusual. Nothing that felt like closure, or warning, or any of the things people assume in retrospect they should have felt. Just a Tuesday night at my best friend's apartment, exactly what it appeared to be and nothing more. At 11, I stood up from the couch. I grabbed my jacket from the back of the chair where I always left it whenever I came over, a habit so automatic I didn't even think about it. I told him I was leaving. He was still on the couch, remote control in hand, looking for something else to watch, wearing that lightly focused expression he always had when scrolling through streaming options and finding too many. He said, yeah, without looking away from the screen. I closed the door. I walked down the 3 flights of stairs. Stepped outside into the October air, where the cold hit my face with that sharp immediacy cold always has when you've just left a warm room, and that night it felt like something more than temperature, though I didn't know what, didn't give it a name, didn't give it importance. And that was it. No hug. No take care, no talk to you later, none of those tiny closing rituals people use when they know they're saying goodbye. Just a door closing and two people naturally assuming there would be another Tuesday after that, and another after that, and dozens more after all of those, because that's how it had always been and there was no concrete reason to think otherwise. The first few days without hearing from him didn't worry me at all. Daniel was like that, always had been. It was part of his personality, something I'd learned to read years ago. He went through phases. Phases where he'd disappear from his phone for days at a time, not because he was avoiding anyone specifically, but because the phone stopped seeming relevant to him, because he'd gotten absorbed in a book or a project or some idea that consumed all his attention and turned the outside world into an interruption. Everyone who truly knew him understood this. It was so consistent that we barely even mentioned it anymore. Wednesday passed without a reply. I thought nothing of it. Thursday too. I sent him a meme, which was usually my way of pulling him out of silence because memes were the one thing that consistently broke through his disappearances. Nothing. Friday I sent another message, more direct this time, asking if he was okay. Nothing. Saturday was the first time I called. The phone rang 4 times. Voicemail. Daniel's calm voice telling me to leave a message. I didn't leave one because we never left each other voice messages. It was one of those unspoken rules between us, the kind you don't remember agreeing to but that exists anyway. I called again on Sunday. Voicemail again. And then, without being able to explain exactly where it came from or why it arrived at that specific moment, I started feeling something low in my stomach that I still wouldn't call fear because it didn't have that shape yet, but it also wasn't the indifference of the previous days. It was more like a nameless discomfort, a question that hadn't yet decided whether it had the right to ask itself. On Monday, at 9 in the morning, I called his workplace. The person who answered was someone from administration, a woman's voice that sounded polite and carried the professionally neutral tone people train themselves to use when delivering bad news without making it sound like bad news yet. She told me Daniel hadn't shown up since Wednesday, that they tried contacting him several times, that they hadn't received any response, that if I was family or a close friend, then maybe I should. She didn't finish the sentence. I didn't let her. I hung up and stood there in my kitchen with my phone still in my hand and the coffee I'd made 5 minutes earlier cooling on the counter, and I stayed there for a stretch of time I couldn't measure, my thoughts circling something that still didn't have a complete shape but already carried weight. That was the moment I understood this wasn't just another phase. And that was the moment I realized it had been 6 days since I'd heard anything from my best friend, and that I, the person who'd known him since we were both 16 years old, who knew how he breathed when he was nervous and what he always ordered in restaurants, hadn't lifted a single finger until Monday morning when a stranger told me to. I went to his apartment that same afternoon. I had a key. I climbed the 3 flights of stairs, knocked even though I already knew there wouldn't be an answer, slid the key into the lock and opened the door. What I found when I entered his apartment that afternoon was not what I expected to find, and what I didn't find was much worse. I'd had the key to his apartment for exactly 2 years and 4 months. I remember it with that strange precision memory sometimes reserves for minor details while erasing things that matter far more. He'd given it to me on a Sunday in June, without any drama, barely even a comment, simply because we saw each other so often that eventually the ritual of me waiting in the hallway while he came downstairs to open the door had stopped making sense to either of us. He'd placed the key in my hand with that economical way he had with gestures, said, "So you don't have to wait," and gone back inside. I tossed it into the drawer of my nightstand that evening, and after that I barely thought about it again. That Monday afternoon, I held it between my fingers for a moment before leaving home. It was a silver key, no keychain attached, completely anonymous, the kind of object that carries no weight of its own until suddenly it carries all of it. The building was quiet when I arrived. The woman from the first floor, someone I'd seen enough times for us to recognize each other even though we'd never exchanged more than a greeting, was coming out with her small white dog just as I stepped through the entrance. She looked at me with the familiarity of someone who has watched you climb the stairs dozens of times and knows you belong there even if she doesn't know exactly who you're visiting. I climbed the 3 flights. The elevator still had the out-of-service sign taped to it, the same one that had been there since April and that someone had laminated at some point, as if the situation had lasted long enough to justify protecting the paper. The 3rd floor hallway smelled the way it always did, old paint and something cooked drifting from one of the apartments, something that could have been absolutely anything. I knocked before using the key. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more. The way I always did when I arrived. I waited. Nothing. I knocked again, louder this time, with my knuckles flat against the wood. Nothing. I inserted the key. The door opened. The first thing that hit me before I even turned on the light was the silence. Not the clean silence of an empty apartment, which has its own neutral texture, almost airy. This was the dense silence of a place that had accumulated too much stillness, that had been quiet longer than it should have been. It was the silence of something interrupted. I turned on the light. I stopped in the doorway without moving for several seconds. The apartment looked exactly the way I remembered it from the week before. And I mean exactly, with a precision that took me a moment to process because at first it felt normal, familiar, almost comforting, until rational thought settled in and I understood what it meant. The couch cushions in the same place. The dining table with Daniel's book still lying open face down on the page where he'd left it, as if he'd interrupted his reading to use the bathroom and might return any second. The glass in the kitchen sink. The remote control on the couch, tilted slightly to the left, exactly the way he always left it. And then I saw it. The pizza box on the kitchen counter, closed, exactly where Daniel had set it that Tuesday night. I recognized it immediately. It was the same one. I walked over to it, lifted it slightly, smelled it without opening it. That was enough, that specific smell of food that's been sitting too long in a closed space, no longer smelling like food but like something before food, something heavier and more organic. I opened it anyway. The leftover pizza from Tuesday, exactly as Daniel had left it, with the obvious intention of eating it for lunch the next day, which was something he always did because he insisted reheated pizza was better than fresh pizza, one of the few arguments I could never really challenge because he was right. No one had thrown it away. No one had come back to clean it up. I went to the bedroom. The bed was unmade, which for Daniel meant absolutely nothing by itself. But the room as a whole had something difficult to articulate precisely and yet physically obvious at the same time. It was the room of someone who had gotten up one morning fully intending to come back. Every object placed where it made sense for someone who lived there and planned to keep living there. Not the room of someone who had left. I walked over to the desk chair where his backpack sat, the same black one he took to work every day. I opened it. Inside, his laptop. Charger neatly coiled. A folder of documents I didn't touch. The headset he used for work calls. The small notebook he always carried around to jot things down. Everything inside. The entire backpack, as if he'd come home the night before and dropped it there for the next day. I went into the bathroom. His toothbrush in the holder beside the sink, leaning at that specific angle because the holder itself was slightly crooked and Daniel had never bothered fixing it. His deodorant on the shower shelf. Electric razor plugged into the charger. And in the medicine cabinet, when I opened it, the bottle of sleeping pills he'd been taking for the last 2 years, the ones he'd struggled to admit he needed and had only started using after months of me and Laura and everyone else telling him sleep mattered, that nobody functioned properly without it, that asking for help wasn't defeat. The bottle was almost full. I went back to the living room, sat down on the couch, on the same side Daniel always sat on, and stared at the apartment from his usual perspective for what must have been several minutes without moving. A person who decides to leave takes things, even if it's only a few things, even if it's the bare minimum. Voluntary absence has a different texture than this. It leaves marks of decision, of preparation, however small. What I had in front of me was something else. It was the apartment of someone who had stepped out to do something and never returned. Not the apartment of someone who had taken his life somewhere else. I called Laura. Laura Reyes was the only other person in the world who knew Daniel as deeply as I did, maybe more deeply in some ways, maybe less in others, but with that kind of understanding that comes from having been close to someone for a very long time. They dated for nearly 2 years, from ages 23 to 25, and the breakup had been one of the complicated ones, the kind that leaves unfinished things hanging in the air for a while, the kind where you don't know whether those things will ever truly resolve themselves. But eventually they had, or at least they'd reached the point where the two of them could talk without active pain living inside the conversation, and for them that counted as a real achievement. She answered on the first ring, which already told me something, because Laura never answered on the first ring unless she was actively staring at her phone. "Hey," she said. And there was something in that hey that wasn't just a greeting. "When was the last time you talked to Daniel?" I asked without any preamble, because in that moment preambles felt like an unnecessary luxury. Pause. "Why are you asking me that?" she said. "Because I haven't heard from him in a week," I said. "Because his job told me he hasn't shown up since Wednesday. Because I'm sitting on his couch and last Tuesday's pizza is still sitting on the counter and his backpack with his laptop is in the bedroom and his pills are still in the cabinet and there's no sign anyone's been here since I left last week." The silence that followed lasted longer than it would have if Laura knew nothing. "Laura. He texted me," she finally said. Her voice came out lower than usual, with that specific tone people get when they're choosing every word carefully. "Thursday. A short message. Said he needed time, that I shouldn't worry, that he was okay." I processed that. "And you answered." I asked what was going on. "He left me on red." I waited a day and texted again. "Nothing. Why didn't you call me?" Another pause. Different from the first one. More uncomfortable. Heavier. "Because Daniel asked me not to," she said. Not in those exact words, but that message was clearly from someone who wanted space without people searching for him. And I thought if he'd explained things to anyone else, it would have been you. I thought you knew. I thought he was with you. There it was. The perfect mistake. Her assuming I knew. Me assuming it was just another phase. Daniel, somewhere, taking advantage of exactly that to disappear for days without anyone making a move. I asked her to describe the message word for word. She did. Short, just like she'd said. Direct. Missing the kind of details people give when they want someone to truly understand, written with the kind of economy people use when they want to say enough to calm you without saying enough to invite questions. I asked if the number the text came from was his usual one. She checked her phone. Yes. I asked whether Daniel had mentioned anything unusual in the weeks before he vanished, anything out of the ordinary, no matter how insignificant it might have seemed at the time. The silence before she answered was the silence of someone reviewing an internal conversation before deciding which part of it to share. "There was something," she said, "about 3 weeks earlier. He asked me something that seemed strange at the time, but I didn't think much of it because with Daniel, sometimes strange questions are just strange questions." "What did he ask?" "He asked if I thought it was possible to owe someone something that wasn't money. Not an emotional debt, not exactly that, he made that clear. Something else, something different, something he either couldn't or wouldn't explain further. When I asked him to clarify, he changed the subject and never brought it up again." The sentence hung between us inside that phone call silence that has a density of its own. At the time I filed it away as one of his things, Laura continued. "You know how he was. How he is. How," she stopped. The sentence remained unfinished, and both of us let it stay that way because neither of us wanted to be the first to correct the tense. I asked her to send me a screenshot of the message Daniel had sent on Thursday. She did. I read it several times. It was short, just like she'd said, carrying that specific precision of someone who knows exactly what they want to communicate and exactly what they want to avoid communicating. I took a picture of it. That night at home, I stared at it for a long time, trying to figure out what bothered me about it without being able to define it. It was after midnight when I found it. Once I saw it, it became so obvious that I couldn't understand how I'd missed it before. Daniel didn't use commas when texting, ever, or almost never, except in very specific situations where ambiguity without a comma could change the meaning of something important. It was such a consistent trait that I'd absorbed it as normal without ever consciously noticing. I'd seen him write thousands of messages. Never unnecessary commas. The message he sent Laura had 2 commas. Perfectly placed. Grammatically correct. I stared at that for a long time, telling myself it was stupid, that people change the way they write, that maybe that particular day Daniel had decided to punctuate differently for some meaningless reason. I told myself that several times in several different ways, but I still couldn't sleep. Laura took too long to reply, and when she finally did, what she said sent the cold from the apartment rushing straight into my bones. We met that same night. No explanation was needed for where. There was a cafe exactly halfway between Laura's place and mine, a spot we had all been to many times alone, together, and also the 3 of us, back in the time when the 3 of us was just that, without any complications attached to the number. It was one of those cafes that have been in the same place for so long that they've become part of the city's landscape, with wooden tables that are never quite the same shade because they've been sanded and refinished so many times that each one carries its own visible history on the surface. I arrived first. Ordered a coffee I didn't drink. Sat at the back table, the one we always used when whatever we were about to talk about wasn't meant for everyone in the room to hear. Laura arrived 10 minutes later. I recognized her from across the glass by that way she walks, the kind that projects urgency even when there isn't any, that quick stride that makes it look like she's always late even when she almost never is. That night, the urgency was real, and it showed in more than just her steps. It showed in her face, in the way her jaw was slightly clenched, which in her always meant she was holding something back. She sat down across from me, didn't order anything, didn't take off her coat, put her elbows on the table and looked straight at me for a second before speaking. Before you say anything, she began, I want you to know that if I had thought this was serious, I would have called you that same Thursday. I swear I would have. I know, I said. And it was true. I knew Laura well enough to know she wasn't the type to hide things for petty reasons. I'm not here to assign blame. I'm here because I need to know everything you know. She nodded, took a breath. She told me the full context of the message, details she hadn't given me over the phone. She told me that on Thursday afternoon, when she received Daniel's message, she was at work, and she had read it twice and felt something off, but decided that off wasn't the same as concerning, and that Daniel had every right in the world to take time without giving detailed explanations to anyone. But she also told me something she hadn't said on the phone. That the night before the message, on Wednesday night, Daniel had called her. Not a text, a call, which was something Daniel almost never did because he preferred messages for everything that wasn't urgent. It had rung through, and when she checked her phone 20 minutes later, she saw the missed call and texted him asking what was wrong. There had been no reply that night. And the next morning, the message had arrived. Why didn't you tell me about the call when we talked earlier? I asked. Because I connected it to the message, she said. I thought he called to say the same thing he later wrote, that he'd gotten halfway through the call and backed out and decided to put it in writing instead. I didn't think twice about it. She paused. Now I think twice about it. We talked about what each of us had noticed in the weeks before, trying to build a more complete picture of how Daniel had been. It was a strange exercise, because when someone seems fine, or is fine, you don't store the details with the same precision as when you know something is wrong. The memories of those weeks were blurred at the edges, full of the normal gaps daily life leaves behind. But there were things. Small things. Laura remembered Daniel being quieter than usual at a dinner they had shared about 3 weeks earlier. Not dramatically so, not in a way that raised alarms, just more inside himself than usual. She remembered asking him if he was okay, and him saying yes, he was just tired, he'd had a rough week at work. And she believed him, because it was a completely plausible answer and because Daniel wasn't someone who exaggerated his moods to get attention. I remembered something different. About 2 weeks before that last night, we were walking after lunch and Daniel made a passing comment about a TV show he'd seen, something about a character who made a mistake in his youth and spent decades unable to let it go. I remember it because the comment carried a slightly out-of-place intensity for the context, one of those sentences that feels heavier than the moment it belongs to. But I let it pass, because Daniel sometimes made those unexpected connections between what he watched and what he thought, and he didn't seem interested in going deeper into it. The debt he mentioned, Laura said when I told her this. The one that wasn't money. I think he was referring to something he did. Something he thinks he did wrong. Do you have any idea what? No. And I thought about it that night, after he changed the subject, and I came to the same conclusion I have now. Daniel has a part of his life none of us really knows well. Not because he hides it actively, but because he's never shown it to us. And we've never asked. That stuck with me. Because it was true, and because it was uncomfortable that it was true. 11 years of friendship, and there was a part of Daniel I had never explored because he had never invited me into it, and I had accepted those limits without questioning them, because Daniel's limits never felt like limits. They just felt like who he was. We agreed we'd both try to remember anything else that might matter and talk again the next day. We left the cafe together. At the door, before we separated, Laura told me something she hadn't planned to say. I could tell by the way she said it, that slight hesitation of someone unsure whether they should. Daniel told me something once, she said. A long time ago, when we were still together. He said the hardest thing about himself was that he didn't know when to ask for help, that he always waited until he couldn't anymore, and by then it was sometimes too late for help to be easy. I didn't say anything. I nodded. I left. The next morning, instead of going to work, I went to Daniel's apartment. This time with more time, more calm, and the determination to go through everything with a level of attention I hadn't had the day before. 4 hours. I went through drawers one by one. I went through notebooks, of which there were several scattered around the apartment, each with its own function, because Daniel had this system of writing things on paper that he considered more reliable than any digital app. I found lists, loose ideas, quotes from books, sketches of projects that had never made it past paper. Nothing that stood out. In the desk there was a drawer I hadn't checked the day before because it was at the very back and I had assumed I had already gone through the desk. I opened it. Bills. Insurance documents. The instruction manual for an appliance he no longer had. Random papers that anyone accumulates in a drawer like that. And at the very bottom, underneath everything, an envelope. White. No name written on the outside. Sealed. I held it in my hand for a moment longer than I should have, with that specific feeling of standing in front of something that is about to change the dimension of what you were looking for, without yet knowing whether for better or worse. I opened it. Inside was a sheet of paper. A single sheet folded into 3, the kind you find anywhere at home. On it was written, in Daniel's handwriting that I would recognize anywhere, a phone number. And below the number, a name. Marcus. Just that. The number and the name. No last name. No context. No indication of who Marcus was, or what his relationship to Daniel was, or why his name and number were in an envelope at the bottom of a drawer. I took a photo of the page. Folded it. Put it back in the envelope. Returned the envelope exactly where I found it, under the papers, at the back of the drawer. I asked about that name to everyone I could ask without it sounding too urgent. Laura, who had known Daniel longer than I had in some contexts. 2 mutual friends from the old school circle. Daniel's coworker, someone I had some contact with. No one recognized the name. No one had ever heard it mentioned. I held the phone in my hand for 10 minutes before deciding. I called the number. It rang. Once, twice, 3 times, 4, 5. I thought it was going to voicemail and was already preparing what to say if it did. Then someone answered. They didn't speak. No hello, no identification. Just the sound of someone on the other end. A breath. A presence. I said my name. I said I was Daniel's friend. I said I was looking for him and had found this number. The silence on the other end lasted several seconds. Long enough to make me wonder if there was anyone real there, or if I had connected to something automated that didn't respond. Then a voice said, I know who you are. It was an adult voice, calm, with a cadence that carried no urgency or nervousness in any syllable. Not threatening. Not comforting. The voice of someone who has information and is still deciding, in real time, what to do with it. How do you know who I am? I asked. And then it said something that froze me in a way I hadn't felt the entire time I'd been searching for Daniel. Because Daniel talked about you many times, it said. He told me that if anything happened, if he couldn't, that you would be the one to call. Then I saw the number, and the name beneath it, and I knew, without yet knowing why I knew it, that there was the door. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in my bed with the phone on my chest and my eyes on the ceiling, and my mind doing what the mind does when it finds something that doesn't fit, circling, returning, approaching from another angle, backing off, circling again, searching for the reasonable explanation, telling itself that the explanation exists and that only a missing detail remains, a piece of context, something that once it appears will make everything else fall into place. If anything happened, if he couldn't, that you would be the one to call. Those words implied something I was still resisting fully accepting, because accepting it meant accepting that Daniel had anticipated this situation, that he had imagined a scenario in which he couldn't do something, that he had placed me in that scenario without telling me anything, without giving me the chance to ask, or prepare, or simply know, and that he had kept Marcus's name and number in an envelope at the bottom of a drawer, not in his phone where I could have easily found it, but on paper, as if he knew I would have to go that far, as if the process of finding it was part of the design. At 7 in the morning I stopped trying to sleep and got up. I showered. I got dressed. I made coffee. I did all the things people do in the morning when they need something to hold on to before the day starts asking for things. And then I picked up my phone and called Marcus's number. He answered on the second ring. I need to see you, I said. No preamble, no good morning, none of the courtesy phrases that at that moment felt like a waste of time. There was a short pause. I was expecting this, he said. This afternoon. You choose the place. Another pause, longer this time. I imagined him somewhere I couldn't picture, processing the request, deciding. There's a bar, he said finally. On Merced Street, between 5th and 6th. It's called El Farol, though the sign is half broken and only says El Far. 6 o'clock. He hung up. I stayed in my kitchen holding the phone, with the coffee I hadn't touched going cold beside me, trying to figure out what to do with the hours separating me from 6 in the evening. I had no work I could focus on, no energy for anything normal that fills a day. So I went back to Daniel's apartment. I don't really know why. I wasn't expecting to find anything I hadn't already found, but there was something about being in that space that felt closer to him than anywhere else, and right now, closeness was what I needed, even if I couldn't fully define it. I sat on his couch. Picked up the book that was open face down on the table, the one he'd left unfinished. I looked at it. It was a novel I hadn't read, but Daniel had mentioned it several times, saying it was exactly the kind of book he liked, no excessive pretension, characters in which you could recognize something of yourself without the book telling you directly. I opened it to the page where he had left it. I didn't read it, just looked at the page. There was a sentence underlined in pencil, the same pencil Daniel always used to mark books because he said ink was irreversible and pencil gave you the possibility of changing your mind. The sentence read, one does not escape what one has done. One learns to carry it differently. I stared at it for a long time. Then I closed the book. left it on the table, face down, exactly where I had found it. I arrived at the bar 20 minutes early. It was exactly the kind of place you would expect from someone choosing a location for a conversation meant for no one else's ears. Small, tables not too close together, lighting just bright enough to see the person in front of you but not so bright that you felt like you were on a stage. The sign outside indeed read only El Far, the last letters worn away completely. I ordered water. Sat at a table toward the back. Waited. Marcus arrived on time. I recognized him the moment he walked in, not because I knew what he looked like, but because he entered like someone who had been there before and knew exactly where he was going, without hesitation at the door, without scanning the room. He walked straight to my table. Around 40, I guessed. Maybe a little older. Dark hair with gray at the temples and in a short beard, giving him the appearance of someone who doesn't spend extra time on his appearance but also doesn't neglect it. Clothes without any trace of effort or carelessness. The kind of person who would normally disappear into public spaces without anyone noticing, with that quality of being invisible without trying. He sat down. Didn't offer a handshake. I didn't either. We looked at each other for a second without speaking, that moment where two people calibrate each other, deciding what kind of conversation this is going to be. Daniel is fine, he said before I could say anything. He said it with the deliberation of someone who knows it is the first thing the other person needs to hear. He is in a safe place, by his own choice. Physically, he is fine. Physically, I repeated. He nodded, not avoiding the implication. How do you know him? I asked. The answer took a moment. We've known each other for 5 years. The context in which we met is something he should tell you, not me. What I can tell you is that we are not friends in the conventional sense. We are people who share a certain history, and a certain responsibility derived from that history. I processed that. Why did he leave? I said. Marcus rested his forearms on the table. His hands looked like someone used to working with them, though I couldn't tell in what way. There is something Daniel did, he began. I'm not going to give you the details because they're not mine to give, but I'll give you the structure, because I think that's what you need to understand what is happening. A long time ago, before I knew him, Daniel made a decision. At the time, he thought it was the right one, maybe even the only possible one, and it had consequences for another person. Not legal consequences. Consequences of a kind that don't have an official name, but are real anyway. What kind of consequences? The kind you carry. The kind that isn't solved with money, or a conversation, or an apology the other person gives you even if they don't fully mean it. The kind you have to resolve in a specific way that can't be done from a distance. I wanted to ask him what Daniel had actually done. I had the very clear impulse to press for specifics, to stop the abstractions and get the facts, but something held me back. It wasn't just respect for my friend's privacy. It was the understanding that in that moment, pushing for details wouldn't help me find him, or understand where he was, or whether he was coming back. Does he know I'm looking for him? I asked. Yes. I called him when you called me. And he asked me to meet you. To explain what I could. To tell you he is okay. Why doesn't he call me directly? Marcus let a second pass before answering, and in that second I saw something in his face that wasn't evasion but something closer to the discomfort of transmitting a truth that he knew would hurt. Because he can't, he said. Not because someone is stopping him, but because he has decided he can't. That if he does, he will stop, and if he stops, he won't be able to finish what he went to do. And he feels he has to finish it. I asked if there was anything I could do. If there was any way to contact him, even indirectly. If Marcus could pass anything from me to him. He took out his phone. Unlocked it. Placed it on the table in front of me, screen up. It was a message thread between him and Daniel. He gestured for me to read it. The last message in the conversation was from that same afternoon, just a few hours earlier. It said, tell him it's not what he thinks. Tell him I'm not lost. Tell him there are things you have to do alone even if it hurts to do them alone. And tell him the Roman documentary was actually quite good, but don't let me admit it, because I know he thought so too. It was Daniel's voice. Completely. Without a trace of doubt. No misplaced commas. His usual spelling, his sentence structure, that specific quiet humor that appears at the end of serious things like a reminder that he is still there, still himself. I stared at the message for a long time. Marcus didn't speak. The bar around us continued its background noise, people and other tables talking about things that had nothing to do with any of this. When is he coming back? I finally said. I don't know. Neither does he. Is there anything I can do? Marcus looked at me with something that wasn't pity exactly, but the recognition of someone who understands what it is to want to do something and be unable to, something he may have felt himself in another version of the same situation. Wait, he said. And don't stop being the person he wants to come back to. I left the bar when the sun had already gone down. I walked without direction for a while, hands in my pockets, October cold on my face, my mind processing everything I now knew and everything I still didn't, which was far more. I thought about the sentence underlined in the book. One does not escape what one has done. One learns to carry it differently. I thought about the fact that Daniel had underlined it in pencil, in case he changed his mind. What Marcus told me in that bar was not what I expected to hear. And yet, when he finished speaking, I understood it was the only thing that made sense. The days after that encounter with Marcus had a different texture from the days before. Before, Daniel's absence was a mystery with urgency, something that demanded movement, that required doing things, calling, going, searching, asking. There was an energy in that process that, although exhausting, was also in some way comforting, because having something to do is always preferable to having nothing. The search gave shape to fear. Now the mystery had fewer dark edges but more depth, and what it demanded was the opposite, stillness, patience. The ability to exist inside uncertainty without trying to force it into resolution, which is one of the hardest things you can ask of someone who loves another person. I returned to my routine in that clumsy way people return to routines when their mind is somewhere else. I went to work. I did what had to be done. I answered messages I had left unanswered. I had conversations where I was physically present and mentally elsewhere, a state most people you know can detect in you even if they choose not to mention it out of courtesy. I told Laura what Marcus had told me. Not everything, only what I felt she should know too, that Daniel was fine, that he had left by his own will, that there was something he needed to resolve and had decided he had to do it alone. Laura listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her, since she tended to process things out loud as she heard them. When I finished, she stayed silent for a moment. "Did you believe him?" she asked. "Marcus." I thought about it before answering, because I had asked myself the same question many times in the hours before and had not arrived at a completely clean answer. "Yes," I said. Not because he gave me many concrete reasons to, but because the message Daniel sent for me was Daniel. Completely. There was nothing in that message that wasn't him. Laura nodded slowly. "The Roman documentary," she said. "The Roman documentary." We stayed silent for a moment with that between us, that small phrase that was the most concrete proof we had that Daniel was still Daniel somewhere, that he hadn't dissolved into disappearance but was still there, with his specific humor, with his way of placing important things inside parentheses. The weeks that followed had their own difficulties. Not the kind of dramatic difficulties one imagines when thinking about losing someone's presence, not the kind that belong to stories, but the everyday, persistent kind of missing someone who was part of your daily structure. Missing their number on your phone. Missing having someone you can send a contextless meme to at 11 at night. Missing Tuesdays at his apartment and the boring documentary that ended up becoming interesting and the pizza he insisted tasted better reheated. Missing someone's presence is different when you know that person exists somewhere. It is not grief, which has its own geography and processes. It is something closer to waiting, which has its own as well. Waiting has good days, when the belief that something will resolve itself stays solid and intact, and days when that belief becomes harder to sustain for no specific reason, simply because uncertainty weighs differently depending on the day. I spoke with Marcus once more, 3 weeks later. It was not a long conversation. I asked if he had heard anything. He said yes, that Daniel was fine, that the process was taking longer than he had expected but that this was not necessarily bad. I asked if he could tell me more. He said it was not his place, that he was sorry. I left it there. I went to Daniel's apartment once more, weeks later. I had the keys, I had the right to be there, though every time I went I felt something ambiguous about that right. I entered, opened the windows because the air had been closed for too long, threw away the pizza that had been sitting on the counter for weeks and was no longer pizza in any recognizable sense, washed the glass in the sink, closed the book that had been left face down on the table and placed it on the shelf, because leaving it there indefinitely felt like a small, pointless cruelty. I didn't read it all, but I reread the underlined sentence. The one that said you do not escape what you have done, you learn to carry it differently. And this time I thought about what it would have meant for Daniel to find that sentence, at what point in his reading he might have underlined it, whether he found it comforting or simply honest, and whether there is a difference between those two things when you are carrying something. Before leaving, I went into the bedroom. His backpack was still there, with the laptop inside, with the notebook of notes, the phone charger plugged into the wall, without a phone, the pills still in the cabinet. I locked the door. Kept the key in my coat pocket, closer than the nightstand drawer, because that felt like the right decision for that moment. It was a Monday morning, 5 weeks after that afternoon in his apartment, when the message arrived. From a number I didn't recognize, which made me hesitate for a second before opening it. It could have been anything, but I opened it because at that point in the story I opened anything that could be something. It said, "It will take a little longer, but I'm coming." I read it several times. Looked for commas where there should not have been commas. There were none. The punctuation was exactly what Daniel would use, what he had always used, what I had learned to recognize as his over 11 years of messages. I stayed for a moment with the phone in my hand, in the middle of my kitchen, with freshly made coffee that I actually drank this time, with the morning coming through the window in that cold, clear November Monday light that does not promise warmth but does not deny it either. I replied in the only way I knew how. "I'm still here. No rush." And I closed the phone. This is what you need to know about waiting when you truly love someone. It does not resemble what you think it will. It is not passive. It is not resignation. It is not sitting still while time passes over you without doing anything. It is an active way of continuing to be the person the other needs you to be when they return. It is leaving the door open without announcing that you are leaving it open. It is continuing to live your own life, with its own things and its own complications and its own Tuesdays with pizza and documentaries that start boring and end up interesting, without stopping being available. It is trusting someone who has not given you every reason in the world to trust them, but also none real enough to stop. I do not know when Daniel will return. He doesn't know either, according to Marcus, and that now causes me less anxiety than it did at the beginning, which I don't know if is maturity or resignation or a mixture of both that, over time, you stop needing to distinguish. What I do know is this, that 11 years of knowing someone give you a kind of certainty that does not dissolve with absence, no matter how long it lasts. That the person who sat in the back row of that history class reading a book that had nothing to do with it, and then spent 11 years being the most consistent presence in my life, has not stopped being that person just because he has gone to resolve something I cannot resolve for him. And that when he comes back, and I will keep using that when instead of if until I have a real reason to change it, we will order pizza from the place he found 2 months ago and insists is the best in the city, and we will watch some documentary I will pretend is boring for the first 20 minutes, and the leftovers will sit on the counter for the next day because he says reheated tastes better. And this time, I will not leave with just a yeah.